The following is a not-for-profit podcast discussing a not-for-profit production of fan fiction and is no way affiliated with the not-for-profit production or the original property or its right holders. Welcome back to You're All Doomed, the podcast that has gone through all the Friday the 13th movies 13 minutes at a time, and now we are checking out the fan films. I'm Brian.
And I'm Fan Film Greg.
And this episode, we are discussing Here Comes the Night, a Friday the 13th fan film. I'm just going to say right from the get-go, Greg, that I'm a little disappointed because I was hoping that Here Comes the Night was the sequel to the Kevin James movie Here Comes the Boom, but that is not the case.
I thought we were doing Bring On the Night, the 1985 concert film documenting Sting's first solo album as the Police began breaking up after their masterpiece album Synchronicity.
I mean, we can try to discuss them. I've got notes for both the Kevin James movie and Bring On the Night, so the hybrid you never asked for.
And can't even imagine. Yeah, so Here Comes the Night was made in 2019 by Eternity Productions and is a 19-minute fan film.
The first thing we see is kind of a retro feature presentation animation, very similar to what you'd see at the beginning of like a drive-in movie theater, or I think even Tarantino did something similar at the beginning of Grindhouse, that kind of trilogy of movies of him and Robert Rodriguez and maybe someone else did. Or maybe it was just the two of them. I don't remember, but very just kind of like retro 70s, you're getting ready to watch a grimy horror film. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I loved that. I thought that little bumper was super awesome. That sort of made me think back to like Saturday afternoon matinee syndicated TV channels, which is where I saw a lot of these kinds of movies with like, a little intro and then local commercials, and then you'd start the movie and it was always really lo-fi and just like that. It made me feel warm. Like there was even like a crackling sound to the audio that made me just feel super cozy. I loved it.
I love intros like this that like you said, they kind of like set the stage for something. So there's the old HBO one that just evokes so many childhood memories for me, like you're sweeping down through the neighborhood and the music's soaring. And so like every time I watch that, it's like, okay, we are sitting down to watch a feature presentation. And
I don't know why they don't have that as an option on HBO Max. Like you can always have that play in front of whatever you're watching.
That would be really cool. Yeah. Just have it like queued up for every movie you're going to watch. 'Cause I missed that.
This kicks off with a blonde girl running through the woods at night. And what impressed me right away is that this was not day for night. This was definitely shot in the dark. Nothing against the movie that we watched last time, but the production values seem to be a lot more polished in this outing. So I was impressed immediately by what we were seeing.
You obviously can't see the actual lighting that they're using, but they clearly have some, spotlight that's way up high in the woods, and it's doing a really good job of illuminating the woods. So whatever they're using is pretty serious. It's not just some guy up in the tree with a flashlight. There's like a significant spotlight, even potentially one of those kind of like balloon spotlights that they use to kind of like hoist up above a location to kind of cast some light down on a dark environment. But I thought the same thing, because shooting at night is not easy, and it not only is it lit really well, but it actually looks good. It doesn't look like a poorly lit like Game of Thrones scene, even, where you're just like, why is this so dark? Like it looked really good.
Right, like you can see what's happening, and it was discernible. And she's obviously panicked, and you get like kind of a fuzzy impression of someone walking in the darkness behind her. So it's nice and spooky, and it kicks things off with nice atmosphere. And then we smash to a title card, which is, Here Comes the Night, and it zooms toward the camera and breaks the glass, just like the title card of the original Friday the 13th.
I was going to say it's a ripoff of our podcast logo, but I guess also the movie.
Right. And it didn't blow up, so that's cool.
Yeah. We cut to what I just presume is earlier that day, and we get to some pretty nifty 80s synth music playing as three people arrive in a 70s Ford Bronco. I couldn't get any details on it other than that, but let's just say early 70s Ford Bronco.
Brian.
I know. I'm disappointing everybody. The three passengers are Sarah, who is the blonde girl that we just saw in the cold open, and then there's a guy named Jack who's wearing a headband and listening to a Walkman, and then there's Pete, who is the ubiquitous stoner that you're going to get in movies like this.
And he's wearing a backwards ball cap. I thought that the soundtrack was cute. I liked it. It felt very Stranger Things to me. I don't know how directly inspired it was, or if that's just kind of the vibe that we're in right now. But there was something about the sound that I almost pictured Mike and Eleven running around in the scene. So
it's definitely reminiscent of Stranger Things, and I had to think for a second because this movie came out in 2019, and Stranger Things had definitely been out at least a couple of years before that. So, but it is also just kind of like generic 80s synth music. But
Sure.
yes, if you closed your eyes and someone was like, "Oh, you're watching Stranger Things," you wouldn't dispute that.
There's also one person missing. They refer to a character named Megan, who they're apparently meeting on this camp outing, and she hasn't arrived yet. So it's just these three waiting for more people to show up.
There is a Polaroid of Megan that's taped to the dashboard, and it's like a picture of her smoking a cigarette and throwing up a middle finger, and she's autographed the picture, and it says, "Love you, bitch, heart Megan." So I'm not exactly sure who that's directed to, because Sarah's driving and Jack is in the passenger seat, but it's there. So we at least get our first glimpse of Megan. And
she seems delightful.
Yes.
There's some banter. Obviously Pete, the stoner guy, is a little bit of an outsider, and they tell him he needs to go get some firewood and stuff. And he says, "Well, I need to go piss like a horse race." And I wondered if that was an intentional inversion of the phrase, because that it's piss like a racehorse, because horses have famously powerful streams when they urinate. And that was almost like a malapropism or something. I wasn't sure if that was intentional or a flub.
I think it was, just based on some of the other things that he's said so far and that we'll say later. He's not the brightest bulb in the box, and so he's already said a couple of things that just don't really make a lot of sense. So when he said that too, I wondered that. I was like, was that intentional? And I think it probably was, because even I think Sarah kind of rolls her eyes, but it's hard to know if, like, is she rolling her eyes at him just being crude, or is she rolling his eyes at him being a dumbass?
Right, or like making a dad joke kind of thing.
Yeah. It's at this point that we learn that Megan is Sarah's best friend, which probably answers my question about who that Polaroid was addressed to, because if Sarah was driving the car, it's probably her car, and it was taped to the dashboard. So, okay, that answers that question. But when Sarah mentions Megan, Pete, the stoner in the back seat, says something about like wanting to get with her or something. And Sarah's like, "I would never let you be with my best friend." And Pete's like, "Well, but I already got into second base with her." And then Jake or Jack, whatever his name is like, "Yeah, but that was like an accidental second base," which I thought was funny, because I'm just picturing him like, just like grazing her boob or something as he's like,
right, like a forced error. Like what?
So there's like a lot of weird stuff going on. Like, I'm not quite sure what the dynamic between Jack and Sarah is yet. Pete is just the doofus that's along for the ride, but apparently he had some kind of like brief makeout session with Megan, who's on the way. So we're at least starting to set up the fact that there's going to be four of them, and none of these pieces really fit together all that well.
No, it never really gets completely clear, frankly. There are a couple of, we'll come to that, but yeah, I had questions about these relationships for sure.
And then we get to the point in the movie where the characters have to split up, and it doesn't always have to make sense. And in this case, it definitely doesn't make sense. But Sarah decides that she's going to head to the campsite. Jack decides that he's going to stay behind in the truck and listen to his music. And Pete is off in the woods pissing like a horse race. So we cut to the woods, and we start to get that classic first-person perspective of someone watching from the woods, and we see Sarah not walking an insignificant distance through the woods. And so when she gets out of the car and tells Jack that he has to bring all the stuff to the campsite, that initially didn't seem like too big of a deal. But when you see how far Sarah is walking, you're like, wow, that's a real dick move, because she's walking for a while.
Yeah, that's pretty shitty that she would just like scout off and find the site and leave the heavy work for Jack. But frankly, she's so adorable that I forgive her for it.
Fair enough.
Pete jump scares her with a hockey mask he apparently found while taking a piss. That seems strange and coincidental that you would just pick a random spot to take a leak and then find yourself standing next to a hockey mask that you would then pick up and put on your face.
So Pete finds this hockey mask. Do you think that they have any knowledge? And we also don't know where they are. There's been no establishment that they're at Camp Crystal Lake or anything like that. But do you think that these guys have any knowledge of a Jason Voorhees or a camp killer that wore a hockey mask? Like, I don't get the feeling that there's any kind of like recognition with this hockey mask at first, but
you've hit on my core issue with this movie, which I think we should wait to discuss until the end because of what happens. But you're right. The only reason we know that this is Crystal Lake is because it's been posted on YouTube as a Friday the 13th fan film. So it could be anywhere. I find it hard to believe that people would live in a Jason Voorhees universe and not recognize the hockey mask. I feel like if there was a serial killer in our world who was known for having this very iconic, very frightening looking hockey mask, like people talk about Jeffrey Dahmer's glasses, for God's sake. I mean, I think that Jason's body count and his just general serial killer presentation would be such that the hockey mask would be super famous. So I don't know exactly where this movie is meant to fall in continuity wise. There's some hints of it being kind of 80s, but not necessarily. And I mean, it's probably not meant to think about it too much, but that's an interesting question. And I think we have to come back to it as this movie progresses.
That's fair. Yeah. And I know what you mean about like identifiable features, because and you mentioned Dahmer, but even someone like Richard Ramirez, where it was just like a police sketch, like people were looking and like, oh my God, there's this like, sunken eyes guy with this long black hair. If you saw anyone that matched that description, you'd be like, holy shit, is that him?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but there's no recognition as of yet. And it was kind of like a tricky question because we do kind of get something that later on that makes us, it doesn't really answer the question, but does bring up more questions.
We'll get there, but yeah, it took me out of the movie at that point because for all intents and purposes, Jason's hockey mask is his supervillain costume, and I feel like if we had a serial killer running around in our real world with something so identifiable that it would be plastered all over every goddamn magazine and website in the world, if there was even an artist's sketch of this guy, people would be like, oh, the hockey mask killer. Like, it would just be so captivating that that's a tough thing that filmmakers have to contend with if they're trying to make anything even semi-serious in the Friday the 13th realm.
And it reminded me of the at the beginning of Jason Takes Manhattan, where there's the two high schoolers that are on the boat,
Right.
and then there's the dude that has like the incredibly like screen perfect accurate hockey mask, and it's like, well, like it's okay that if the legend of Jason is out there and they know he wears a hockey mask, like that's fine, but what are the odds that like costume stores are going to have ones that are dinged up and cracked in the exact spots with
Right.
blood stains? Like how would they know all that information? So like this is like one of those instances where like the hockey mask is being introduced for the viewer's benefit, but as of right now, there's the characters, it means nothing to them. It's just a hockey mask.
Right. And in context of this movie, they don't really react to it. So it doesn't seem like, like Sarah doesn't say, "Oh my God, is that that hockey mask guy?" Like they don't make a big deal out of it at all. So I think like we're supposed to believe that it's random to them.
Yeah, he could be wearing a rainbow clown wig and they would still respond the same way, which is just like, "Oh, Pete, you're such a goofball."
Right. Right. He does, however, have a duffel bag full of porn, including a magazine called Drip Dry. Like, why would you read that?
Did you happen to read the details on the cover?
No.
So, well, I did. So,
I didn't want to look closer.
so yeah.
You would zoom in on something called Drip Dry.
Yes, I pulled up the 4K version on YouTube and I zoomed in and read all the details. But like you mentioned, the name of the magazine is Drip Dry, and the subtitle is "The Magazine for Guys Who Like It Wet."
But it has the word dry in the.
Yeah, I know it gets worse. So there's little things off to the side, which I'm just guessing are articles or pictorials that are in the inside. But one of them is "Beach Sluts Like It Rough," which I don't know if there's really any evidence that supports that, but
I don't like sand. It's coarse and it gets everywhere, and
well, of course, or sand is rough. So there you go. This one, I'm ashamed to admit that it reminds me of something, like it's a quote from another movie, but I can't figure out what it is. But all it says is, "Listen close. It sounds like the ocean."
you can leave this pause in if you want to.
Yeah, and I don't know, like, what are we supposed to be putting our ear up to see if it sounds like the ocean?
It makes me think that the vagina is so large that it echoes like a conch shell. I don't
know. It gets worse. The next article is plus clam slams.
That sounds like something I would order at Friendly's. I'm guessing this is a fake magazine. I hope.
Yeah, I'm guessing. And then the last article, it says 75 pages of damp bottoms and sandy spreads.
Damp?
Greg, it's the magazine for guys who like it wet.
But it has the word dry in the title.
I don't know. Okay, so the three of them are standing around, kind of shaking their head at Pete's porn collection. And Sarah says that they need to get some firewood before it gets dark.
And she also says they need to check the area for snakes. And the way that, I forget if it's Jack or if it's Sarah that says that, but the way it's said makes it seem like it's some sort of sexual allusion to something, and it seems like they're gonna go fuck.
Well, it's Sarah who says it, and Jack is the one that responds like any 12-year-old boy would, which is, he's like, "Oh yeah, let's go check for some snakes," even though, like, what?
How do you check for snakes? I don't even know what that means. Like,
well, unless it's
I'm
like
picturing
the girl like checking his pants for snakes or something like that.
Well, that I get
Yeah.
that, but like in terms of like environmental surroundings, how do you check for snakes? Like,
Greg said, like, the snake is the penis. And she's going to check for the penis, but she's saying it's a snake.
Well, what's the mouth?
What's a dick for?
To pee with.
Yeah, so this is like it's setting up that like weird dynamic where
Right.
like are Sarah and Jack together? Because this kind of exchange made it seem like they do have something going on. She kind of rolls his eye or her eyes, but she's not like, you asshole, how dare you say that? She's just like, oh, you're so silly.
Right. They seem a little bit more like brother and sister to me, which is weird given all of these sexual undertones. But they don't have like a caring, tender relationship. They almost have like a little bit of a pushing each other's buttons relationship.
Definitely. Yeah.
So they go down to the lake and he suggests they go skinny dipping, which wisely Sarah declines because lakes are disgusting. And then Jack pisses into the lake. And I have two things to say about that. One is there's a lot of piss taking in this movie already, and we're like 6 minutes in. And secondly, he's pissing into the lake that he wanted to skinny dip in. And I'm like, dude, if you are pissing into this lake, don't you think that other people have done that? And yet you want to be naked swimming around with your girlfriend/sister in this piss-filled lake? For all you know, the lake is entirely urine.
Well, the fact that you're even calling this a lake is awfully generous of you because it's more like a muddy puddle. It's not very it's not a grand lake, but you're right. I thought the same exact thing. Like 30 seconds earlier, he's saying, let's go swimming. And she says, not right now. And he's like, well, I'm just going to take a piss then. And it's like, well, that's disgusting. Like,
Right.
like, why are you doing that? There is a funny line though, that he has when he's like standing on the lake shore and he's taking a leak. And he's just kind of like, he's really proud of himself for peeing in the lake for whatever reason. And right as he's like shaking it off, he goes, hey, an actual lizard.
I didn't get that until just now, but that's pretty funny. But you're right. The lake is sort of like the deep part of the creek that we used to play in. I didn't think about that, but the scope of this movie is a little bit more mundane.
So what do you think of the location so far? Because like with the Jason Lives Again that we watched previously, you don't really get to see a lot of the location, but we weren't really thrilled with what they were showing. The fact that it was in broad daylight also didn't help. But so far, like, what do you think of this wooded area that we've seen?
I mean, so far, this is in broad daylight too, except for that cold open. So I'll leave that aside. To me, I'm enjoying this more because the movie that was filmed in Yorkshire or whatever, for all of its benefits, that was a little too open. It was a little too, like, you could see 300 yards in every direction. There was no foliage. There was no coverage of, blocking your view. And so I felt like, they were working with what they had. So, good for them. But this is a little bit more atmospheric. This is a little bit more like what you and I would have been hiking through in the woods as kids. It's pretty wooded. It's not a huge lake by any means that we've seen yet or anything like that, but I kind of dig it. How about you?
Well, the reason why I brought it up is so over the weekend, my wife and I went on this really long hike in this arboretum that's like 45 minutes outside of Chicago. And we hiked for, a good 6 or 7 miles. So we were out there for a while, and we are obviously in the woods for the majority of this walk. And as I'm walking through it, there was one point where, Greg, I'd sent you a picture of me in the woods with like a scared look on my face. I'm like, oh, but as I was walking around, because we were walking far enough that the environment was changing in terms of like how dense the forest was and the types of trees that were around. And so every time we'd kind of enter a new area, I was like, would this work for like a Friday the 13th location? And there were certain conclusions that I was coming to that I don't know. I'm sure I've thought of before, but I never really spent too much time on it, which was, what do I want the woods in a Friday the 13th movie to look like? And a lot of the woods that we were in over the weekend had this ground cover that was, I'd say, I mean, I'm 6'5", but like waist high ground cover. So like pretty thick, a lot of it's just like weeds and brush and things like that. But I decided I don't like that for a Friday the 13th movie because it creates too many hiding spaces. And the thing that I like about chase scenes in Friday the 13th movies are when there are not a lot of places to hide. And maybe your only option is to hide behind a tree. And I like being able to see Jason from 100 yards away. Like, that's creepy. And I don't want there to be ground cover that's so dense that Jason could be crouching down 5 feet away from you and just kind of like pop up and be like, boo! Like that's just kind of silly to me. So I'd like, from like a fear perspective in a movie, like obviously if I'm actually the one being chased by Jason, I'd probably want that ground cover. But for a movie, in order for there to be more tension, I kind of like wide open spaces because it creates more darkness. There's like the subtlest like movement is going to attract your attention and scare you. Whereas if there was like tons of bushes and everything blowing around, you're not going to necessarily see someone or hear someone. So again, there's advantages and disadvantages to it depending on which end of the chase that you're in. But I was like, I want woods where there's a lot of trees. There can be ground cover, but I don't want it to be so high that someone can hide in it. But yeah, just kind of I was just trying to like create the ultimate wooded location for a Friday the 13th thing. So I was like, okay, I like these trees. I like this ground cover. And I like this. And keep in mind that it's also October, so like not all the leaves have fallen yet and everything. It probably looks completely different in December, but like this time of year, I was just trying to like pick out which locations I would either want to film a Friday the 13th movie or see one filmed in. So it's just like stupid things like that are going through my mind as I'm going on a hike.
I like that. I have a couple of reactions. One is, I also am 6'5" waist high when I'm laying down. And yeah, I mean, I'm with you. Like, I want some trees. I want them to be kind of spaced out. I want foliage, but not overwhelming brush. I kind of want some deadfalls, like some large dead trees that have toppled, to give some death atmosphere, but not like a blasted out, denuded kind of, brush fire kind of landscape. I mean, I want it to be wooded, but also a little bit spooky. That's kind of what I look for from a Friday the 13th movie.
Right. Like, give me some places to hide, but don't make it incredibly easy for me to find a place to hide.
Yeah, exactly. So Pete is now on his quest for firewood, and he stumbles upon a rock arrangement, a very Blair Witch-esque rock arrangement that says wood, which he finds kind of amusing. And he chuckles to himself and stumbles away, and then the camera rotates, and we find out that it actually spells doom. I'm not sure how I feel about this. What do you think?
I would have preferred that they let us figure that out on our own. Like, logic aside about why these rocks are there or who put those rocks there. Like, in terms of like execution from a creative standpoint, I feel like they revealed the twist almost immediately. Like he looks at it and goes, oh, wood. And he walks away and the camera turns 180 degrees and says doom. And it's like, well, yeah, like I had figured it out before the camera turn, but it would have been cool to like let it sit there even for a couple of minutes where like Pete runs away and then like he's running back, because now he's being chased by Jason and we just see it from a different perspective and we're like, oh shit, it says doom. Like, just something a little bit more subtle with the reveal I would have appreciated. And then I just tried not to think about why it was there. Like, did Jason put that there? I have no idea. But like,
see, I don't think you can. I don't think you can poo-poo that. I mean, I agree. I wish they had been able to stretch it out a little more and had maybe one of the other characters find it from the other perspective. But again, we're talking about a 19-minute short film, so they have a compressed timeline to deal with. But I like the concept. I don't know who would have put that there or why. It's a very Crazy Ralph thing to add, which we need because Crazy Ralph is a factor in these movies. He's a tradition, but
we haven't seen a
what's the
Crazy Ralph
point?
character.
Right. So who did this? Why was it there? No one would necessarily see it unless they were peeing in the woods like Pete. So it didn't make a lot of sense, but I thought it was cute.
It's fair that we can't just dismiss it, especially since I'm the guy that spent 2 episodes convinced that Jason was the one who carved Doom, or carved Jason in the hood of the police car, when in reality
right.
it was Tommy. So I did spend a lot of time complaining about that and who would have done it. So fair point. Yeah, I can't just dismiss it. We don't know if it was Jason. There's some things that we learn at the end of the movie. Could have been someone else. But you're right. It seems more in line with something that a Crazy Ralph would have done, but there has been no introduction of a character like that. So
Right.
it's just there and Pete stumbles upon it. So yeah, I guess I was just too hung up on the reveal of what the word actually was rather than who left it there. But it's
Yeah.
totally
I mean,
fair to
I feel
question
like
it.
the filmmakers are kind of throwing a whole bunch of ideas at the camera because they don't have a lot of time. They want to show everything they've got in their heads as a fan film. That's great. I love that. I like any kind of allusion to the Blair Witch Project, and this is similar, at least in some degree, to the little piles of rocks that they find outside their tents one morning. So I dig it, but I feel like we'll get to this, but the theme of this movie to me is ideas that I wish had been fleshed out more, and this is one of them.
We cut back to Jack and Sarah, and they are popping a squat on some rocks near that lovely mud puddle / lake. And he mentions that he's not too thrilled about being there this weekend and that he's missing the hustle and bustle of the city because, as you know, living in the city ain't no big deal. And Sarah says something like, well, if you want fun and energy, and this is like very much a Scream moment where she's like, there will be plenty of running and screaming and crying soon enough, which is funny. It's cute. It also reminded me of Shaun of the Dead, where the whole movie is like telegraphed in the
Right.
pub at the very beginning. And it's like, well, you're going to get some running, you're going to get some screaming, and you're going to get some crying. Jack acknowledges that this fun and energy is going to be coming in the form of Megan and her drunk friends. So that was weird because up until this point, we were led to believe that only Megan was coming, but now it sounds like it's Megan and some other people. But that's the first we're hearing of it. So we're not sure where Megan and these other people are yet, but we're starting to get a little bit more insight to who these characters are. Jack even mentions some stuff that might be going on back home that he needed to get away from, but they never dive into it. And then we get another weird thing where Jack makes a lame attempt at flirting with Sarah and immediately gets shot down.
Yeah.
But as they walk away, and then they just walk away like nothing ever happened, and then they acknowledge, which was something that I was wondering the whole time, is like, we still haven't gotten our camping supplies yet. Like there's a lot of like walking around in these woods and trying to get to the campsite, but no one has any camp stuff with them yet. So they at least acknowledge like, hey, we got to go get that stuff.
We check back in with Pete, who has found what is kind of like a little lean-to made of branches, almost like a teepee of dried branches. And he sits down underneath the shelter, such as it is, and breaks out his porn to start looking at. Okay, I mean, you're just going to masturbate in the woods? Good for you. and makes a as he's looking at the centerfold, says, "Mr. Kool-Aid Man says, 'Oh yeah,' and that's the kind of thing that, like, when I think about screenwriters, I have to ask, who is this character supposed to be talking to? Is he amusing himself? That kind of thing takes me out of these movies.
Right. Like if it was just him, like if he was just saying that for his own amusement, he wouldn't have added the Mr. Kool-Aid part. He would have just been like, "Oh yeah." And he would have
Right.
known that it was like a Mr. Kool-Aid thing, and he may have, perhaps chuckled at that, but kind of setting up the joke for this fictitious audience, yeah, it doesn't make any sense. But
I mean, maybe that was a porno picture of Mrs. Kool-Aid Woman. I don't know.
like crashing through the bedroom wall.
Yeah, right. So then he also fires up a joint, and I did think it was kind of funny. He smokes it and then puts the mask over his face, so the marijuana smoke seeps out through the holes of the hockey mask. Philosophically, I have some issues with that, but I did think it was kind of a cute, funny image.
I feel it was bugging me because when I saw that, I did like it too. I thought it was a cool image to see like the smoke coming out all the different holes in the hockey mask. And I was like, where have I seen this before? And it was one of the scary movies where it was like a spoof on Scream. And there was a guy running around in like a Scream-esque mask. It wasn't quite what you saw in Scream, but very similar to it. And there's a part where he shows up at a party, and instead of killing the people, he stops to smoke a joint with these guys.
Oh, right. And then he gets like a...
And the mask like changes to like this like dirt
Yeah,
face. Right. And then the smoke's like billowing out. I'm like, I'm not saying that's what they were going for, but it took me a while. I was like, where have I seen that image of like smoke pouring out of the mask before? And I'm like, oh, it wasn't the hockey mask. It was a Scream mask. So yeah, thanks, Scary Movie.
Right. So then a looming figure appears in front of Pete, and as with the last fan film that we saw, he offers this person a joint. I mean, is that what you would do in that scenario? I mean, how high are you?
Well, if you think,
I feel like... Go ahead.
well, if you think back to the reboot, there's even a similar scene where the dude's in the shed drinking the whiskey, and I think he offers, or what does he do? Does he offer them a drink, or does he offer them the hockey stick? Because he's like, yeah, is this yours or something? So
Right.
yeah, there is a lot of like offering your soon-to-be killer a gesture of like friendliness. But there's like, yeah, if someone came up to me in the middle of the woods, my first reaction would be like startled and like step back, like, hey, who the hell are you? I wouldn't be like, hey man, let's all have fun.
Yeah, and I feel like I don't care for this because I feel like even within the universe that we are watching, the hockey mask is intended to be a threatening visage. You see this thing and it's spooky because, that's the whole reason this thing works from a marketing standpoint, is that it's kind of creepy. It's got these hollowed black eyes. It's a little bit like a skull, but not directly like a skull. It's kind of a creepy image, and that's why it's so famous. And so these characters aren't reacting to it like that at all. They're just, hey man, you're a cool guy wearing a mask. All right. Like, I don't think that's how I would react if I saw a guy wearing this thing. I feel like they're making a joke out of it because we know it's just this movie guy. And I don't care for that.
Well, in this case, do we know that this dude who just walked up to Pete with the hatchet in his hand is wearing a hockey mask? Because we don't see his face. And
no, I guess we don't, because Pete's wearing the hockey
right,
mask.
because I mean, we can get to the next part. Pete gets killed, and when
right.
Pete gets killed, he drops the hockey mask, and the killer picks up the hockey mask and walks away.
Okay.
So we don't know what his face looks like or what he could be wearing instead of, but we don't know necessarily that he's wearing a hockey mask. Even with the stuff that we learn later in this movie, we're not sure.
He's probably not. Yeah, that's a fair point. I didn't put that together, but he's probably not. But given what we know of, I mean, let's just assume this character is Jason.
He's not looking great.
Given Jason without a hockey mask is still not somebody you'd be like, hey, man, want a joint? Like, he'd be like, dude, are you all right? Like,
Yep. Yeah, both are. They're both
yeah.
valid points. Like whether he has a mask or not, you're not going to be just. I think it's just like the stoner mentality of like, hey, peace and love, man. Here you go. Let's share this. But like,
Yeah,
I just don't know how
I don't
realistic
care
it
for
is.
I don't care for that. So at least this issue is settled because Pete gets an axe in the head, which causes the famous cleft in the top right corner of Jason's mask, of the hockey mask. So they kind of create the iconic version that we all love from Part 4. It's a decent kill. They have to cut away judiciously, but I do like that Pete has some smoke wafting out of his mouth as he lays there with blood covering his face.
We then make a pretty significant time jump to later that night, and we get an even more confusing dynamic, especially where we left Jack and Sarah last time. But it's the vantage point is from outside the tent, but there's light inside the tent, so we can kind of see this like shadow puppet version of Jack and Sarah messing around.
We spend a lot of time focused on a Toshiba tape deck with auto reverse, I should point out.
True. I didn't mention that. But right, so you thought Jack and Sarah could potentially not necessarily be brother and sister, but had like a brother and sister relationship. There's been a couple of like swings and misses on Jack's part from trying to mess around with Sarah, and then suddenly we jump to them in the tent and they are messing around. So we're like, okay. So they're together, they're messing around. Sarah says something about does Pete have protection? And of course there's always this like, what do you mean protection? And she's like a rubber. And so,
well, Brian, it feels better without it, man. I mean nothing's gonna happen. Just I want to feel you,
babe. I love you.
I mean, it's just pure. And yet they're fully clothed when they come out of the tent to get the condom.
True, right. So they were making a pretty big jump to the next step. They were going from first base to rounding home, I guess.
Diarrhea.
So Pete and Sarah leave the tent to go look for
Jack. Pete's dead.
Whatever. Jack and Sarah leave the tent to go look for a rubber, and they're kind of like looking through a backpack or something, and Jason shows up. And this time we do get a good look at him. It's this rather scrawny looking guy holding a machete, but he is wearing a hockey mask. But if I'm not mistaken, the hockey mask did not have a gash in the right-hand side.
Oh, ouch. Oh, I didn't notice that. I did like the reveal. It was framed nicely. Like Jack is, standing in the frame and bends down to rummage in the backpack, and behind him Jason is there. So it was like, oh, that was clever. I dug that. But yeah, Jason's a little bit scrawny.
But we also get our first indication that goes back to our conversation about would they recognize the hockey mask, because the first thing Jack says is, dude, aren't you a little short to be the Camp Blood slasher? So that's just a different nickname for what we're presuming is Jason Voorhees. But so there's at least this knowledge that there's this killer out there, and the hockey mask could be some kind of giveaway, because that's the first conclusion that they come to, is that he's the Camp Blood slasher. So,
and we know that Star Wars exists in this universe. So,
yes.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Now we've established that Jason, at least on some level, is a thing in this world. But they think it's Pete. So Jack walks over to take the mask, but then gets his throat slit by a swing of a machete. Even though we saw this person holding an axe earlier.
Yeah.
There's some weapon continuity in this movie.
Yeah.
He bleeds out as, Jason, we'll call him Jason, does a famous head tilt, and Sarah freaks out, as you would expect, and runs. So Jack is still alive, gasping for breath on the ground, but then Jason looms over him and runs him through with a downward stab.
Sarah is understandably terrified, so she's run off into the woods and she's hiding behind a tree while she's trying to catch her breath. And while she's sitting there, Pete's body slumps on top of her, which isn't necessarily out of character in a Friday the 13th movie, even though it kind of defies logic of like, of all the places that she could have run to, she's going to run to the part where Pete got killed, but whatever.
Yeah, I almost wondered if Jason like knew where she was and threw Pete at her.
Oh, I didn't think about that, but it's possible because like the very next thing we see, we start to get a better idea of where Sarah is, and she's actually in a ditch. And there's this cool kind of lighting from behind where Jason is standing on top of the ditch. And so the shadow of Jason is casting down on Sarah. So it's conceivable that he, standing on top of the ditch, just chucked Pete's body down on top of Sarah. Like I prefer that than just her sitting next to it the whole time and not realizing it.
Although you then have to ask, like, was Jason carrying Pete's body around on his backpack? Like, how did, like,
or Pete could have been very close to where Sarah was, and then Jason picked him up. But one thing that I noticed about the silhouette that's being not just cast down on Sarah, but also when we get like a clean like shot and like he's lit from behind, so you can't really make out a lot of details, but you can tell that this particular person is huge, like much bulkier, and he's carrying a hatchet and not a machete. So it's that whole continuity thing where it's like, who is this dude? Does he just have like this arsenal of weapons in his backpack? Like, what's going on? But it's like, it's very much a different looking person than the one that just killed Jack.
Agreed. I will, I'll give credit to the filmmakers. It's a pretty nicely lit shot. It's a cool image, regardless of any, story context. This is a pretty slick looking fan film. We get basically a repeat of the shot from the cold open before the title card. Sarah's hiding behind the tree, and we see Jason kind of stomping in the woods behind her, but yeah, he's carrying a machete, clearly. So I'm not sure quite what's going on with the weapons here.
There's a lot of shots of Sarah hiding behind trees and crying, and we see a shot of Jason kind of stomping through the woods, and this time he's holding a machete. So again, it's not really clear what's going on. And Sarah, for whatever reasons, decides to catch her breath in a wide open space. And so she's just kind of like standing in the middle of the woods with no protection. And she's just kind of like catching her breath, trying to figure out what her next move is.
But there's one shot. It's supposed to be artful of crows or birds of some kind flying into the moon, but I guarantee it was day for night. It just rubbed me the wrong way. And that was the one thing in this movie that I thought was a little bit cheesy filmatically.
I know the exact shot you're talking about. Yeah, I couldn't tell if like the moon was fake. It probably makes more sense that it was day for night, which is probably why it didn't look real. But yeah, it's just kind of like the tops of trees and you see some birds flying away. And we haven't really seen any shots like that up to this point in this movie, so it doesn't make sense. Like in the old Friday the 13th movies, you'd get a lot of like moon over the lake establishing shots, but this one was just kind of like, it just seemed really out of place. And if anything, I felt like it took away from the moment. Like you're building all this tension of someone running through the woods and hiding, and then all of a sudden it's like, here's this beautiful, serene shot of the moon with some birds flying by. Okay, back to the chase.
Agreed.
So as Sarah's catching her breath, she turns around and Jason is standing right behind her. He looks completely different than the Jason we just saw minutes earlier at the campsite. He's much bigger, and the mask doesn't have the gash from where Pete got the hatchet in his head. But there's really no time for her to question Jason's appearance because Jason punches through her chest cavity, killing her instantly.
Yeah, which was startling. It was a pretty cool shot. I dug it, but I was so surprised by that I wasn't sure what to expect. And we hear as Sarah's body's laying on the ground, we hear, "Sarah, where are you?" Which we presume is her friend Megan looking for her. And out of the darkness come three people wearing hockey masks. Two of them are men, and one of them is a slender woman. They find Sarah's body.
Greg, I got to talk to you about something. So, one of these Jasons is kind of like sexy. Um, she's got a rockin' bod, and she's wearing a hockey mask, and I'm very confused, and I don't know what to think. But I've never had to deal with this before in a Friday the 13th movie where I'm suddenly finding myself potentially attracted to the man behind or the person behind the mask. So I don't know what to do here. I'm a little.
That's fair. I mean, so I encountered that when I was dating this girl who wore kind of ratty crop-topped red and green sweaters and hobo hats, and I mean,
Had really long fingernails.
She had a glove. I'm not going to tell you what she did with it, but you know. So it took me a while to figure out that was a woman, because I was so puzzled by what was happening that I didn't pay enough attention to that. So I'm going to go back and watch that part again.
Right. And it is a confusing scene. I think that's meant to be the point. But yeah, seeing three people dressed identically as Jason come out of the woods, it was a real kind of like, what the fuck moment. And I wasn't expecting it. And I gotta say, and we can get into more of the logistics of this, but like, I gotta say I liked the idea at first, because when it first happened, the thing that popped into my head was The Strangers, which is one of my favorite horror movies. And the thing that makes that movie so creepy is it was just three people that just showed up at this house. There's absolutely no context to why they're at this house. Like, they literally just say they were bored. They had nothing else to do. And so they just showed up at this house and decided to torment them. So I'm like, that's kind of a cool idea. If this is three people that dressed up as Jason and just decided to fuck with these campers because there was nothing to do.
Right. I don't feel like we're there yet, because so we have a few more seconds where two of these Jasons are men, and they seem very surprised and disturbed by seeing Sarah's body laying on the ground, and they're sort of like, wait, what? What's going on? What the hell happened? What do you want us to do? And then they turn to the hot, sexy Jason, and she takes off her mask, and it's this very attractive young woman who says, "Die." And then Jason appears and guts these two guys with one stroke. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on here. And I feel like this is where we need to get into this swerve. I think that there's a lot that could be very cool about this, but I'm not sure what's going on here.
You're right. And I did jump the gun a little bit there by coming up with the strangers scenario, but you're right. 'Cause like, it doesn't, like, once all this stuff happens, suddenly it doesn't make as much sense, because you're like, okay, so this is Megan and her two friends that were, supposedly like the drunken life of the party people. They show up, they were playing a joke. Fine. But then, as you mentioned, they're shocked by what they're seeing, so they don't know what's going on. And now they're just there kind of witnessing it. And then, do you want me to say, well, I mean, you already said how Megan appears to be in on the plan, because now she's like suddenly in cahoots with the real Jason.
Or she's got some sort of sinister agenda. And so she's there. She's obviously there to have someone be killed. I don't know what those other two guys are there expecting to do. Like if they thought they were just going to be scaring some friends or what. Megan seems to be there to stir up some pretty evil shit. But I can't figure out what those other two dudes are there for.
Well, let's jump to what happens next because it convolutes things even further. So the two guys just as Jason get killed by what we believe is real Jason. And this was done, we are led to believe, on Megan's orders. Like Jason was following her orders. He kills these two guys. And so then now it's just Megan and Jason, and they're just standing face to face. And we're like, okay, Megan somehow was in cahoots with Jason. They had some plan all along, and they're going to go live happily ever after. But as she reaches to take off his hockey mask or touch his hockey mask or something, she grabs him, or he grabs her by the throat, picks her up off the ground and breaks her neck and throws her on the ground. So Jason has no fucks to give about Megan. So then what was that dynamic? Like, was there an arrangement that Megan made where she showed up and had a conversation with Jason? It was like, hey, I need you to do this. And then Jason like reneges on his deal at the end. Like, that doesn't make any sense.
No. So, I mean, that's the end of the movie. I mean, like, you know, he kills Megan, like you say, and then he picks Sarah's, you know, legs up off the ground and drags her away. And that's the end of the movie. So, yeah, I mean, I feel like Megan was some sort of crazy Jason or Mrs. Voorhees devotee who thought she understood Jason, and by bringing him, you know, victims, that she could ingratiate herself to him. And, you know, I don't know if she had like a kink for Jason or what, but she had some sort of agenda that Jason was not aware of, but she thought she could win him over. I don't know why she had these other two dudes with her or what they were going to get out of it, but she clearly miscalculated that, you know, Jason doesn't give a shit about anybody but him and his mom. So he's not going to care if she's super cute with gorgeous eyebrows and wants to screw him. He's going to kill her. He doesn't care. But I don't think that they had any sort of pre-established relationship. If it's even Jason, which you've kind of alluded to, I don't know.
Well, I don't even know how to make this work, because when you see the three Jasons come out of the woods or out of the darkness, they look like the one that showed up at the campsite that killed Jack, like the scrawny pencil neck Jason version. Mm-hmm. So one of those Jasons killed Jack, right?
Right.
So,
I mean,
as far as we know. So the idea of it just being Megan and two friends being like, hey, it would be really funny if we scare these guys. We just show up, we just as Jason, and just scare them. But when they get there, they find out that people are actually getting killed, and they're like, holy shit. But then Megan wouldn't have had that reaction. She would have been like, oh my God, this is like completely backfired. I never thought that there was actually going to be a killer here. We were just here to scare you. But their interaction leads us to believe that there is some understanding there, because like she basically commands him. I mean, he was going to kill them anyway, but Megan commands Jason to kill those two guys. And then she has no fear. She walks right up to him. So she, like you were mentioning with maybe she considers herself some sort of like Mrs. Voorhees role model or something. It just, there's more questions, like the more you think of it. And like, if it was just a prank, fine. But then why would Megan be sympathetic to Jason all of a sudden? And then if it was just a prank, why did one of these guys actually kill Jack, which is what we're supposed to believe? And because it's not like Jack pops back up like, haha, just kidding, it was a joke. He really gets killed. But when they see Sarah's dead body, they're both standing over it shocked, like, oh my God, who did this? Like they're shocked that this crime had been committed, but one of these people apparently just killed Jack. So why are they shocked?
See, I never even thought that Pete and Jack were killed by anybody other than real Jason. But that's interesting.
Well, see, the guy who was stalking Pete, we never saw really a body shot, but we did see him holding a hatchet. And then the guy who shows up at the campsite and kills Jack has a machete.
Yeah.
The big bulky guy who shows up above the ditch above Sarah has a hatchet. So it's like, okay, maybe guy who's chasing Sarah is the same guy who killed Jack or Pete. But then we've still got one of the fake Jasons has killed Jack. So it's not a prank. I mean, like they really are just like they're murderers.
Well, I mean, I think that for sure Megan is. I feel like even her, Sarah, where are you? Like she clearly was laying a trap. I don't know if these two goofballs that she's with were in on it, or if she was the one who killed the other guys. I would almost need to watch it again, knowing how this movie ends, to see if I can pick up clues, or hopefully, I'm really hoping that the second part, because there's a sequel to this, will at least flesh some of these things out more. Yeah, I have a lot of questions coming out of this that I hope were intentional questions on the part of the filmmaker.
And you brought up something that is quite possible, which is that the Jason that killed Jack at the campsite was Megan, because there is the comment about the Jason being a little bit too short, or being too short to be the Camp Blood slasher or whatever. When we see Megan come out of the darkness at the end dressed as Jason, she clearly has a feminine body. They may have just, you couldn't have shown that. Oh, believe me, she had a feminine body. You couldn't have just shown that in the campsite scene with Jack and Sarah, because then you would have been like, it's a girl. And like you would have immediately been onto something. So maybe they intentionally made the clothes a little bit baggier or something, just so you couldn't tell that it was a female. But that is probably the most logical explanation, is that why these two dude fake Jasons were off doing whatever they were doing. Megan had killed Jack. Real Jason had killed Pete. Real Jason killed Sarah. And then they all converge, or what's left of them converge in the woods. And that's why the two guys are like, oh my God, what's going on? And Megan is, not affected by it at all.
Yeah, Megan was hoping to run into real Jason. No one else expected to run into real Jason.
Okay. Yeah, but the interaction between the two still requires us to take a pretty big leap in logic of how did this happen? Why did it happen? Megan and Sarah were best friends, so what snapped? You could have easily set something up earlier.
I'm plotting your death. I mean, I've been plotting your death for years, and it's going to be epic.
Get in line. But there are, like, you could have thrown something in earlier in the movie where it's like, yeah, I don't know what's been up with Megan recently. What? Go ahead.
But they did with the middle finger. I mean, like that hostile photograph on the car was a little bit, like, that's not the best friend vibe that you would, like, can't wait to see you, or like,
yeah.
I feel like there was a little bit of groundwork laid. Maybe not enough, but
that's what I was going to say is it enough? Because even if you just throw in one more reference, like Sarah complaining about Megan, like, yeah, like, I don't know. I think it'll be good for us to get away because Megan's just been acting really weird. She's been very distant, and I'm hoping we can just kind of like talk and see what's going on. Like, just do that.
But we know there was an accident because Pete got to accidental second base.
So is this whole thing fueled by Pete getting an accidental boob brush?
He brushed up against her side boob, and then she's like off the rails.
Well, all right. Well, this has been You're All Doomed.
Groundwork was laid.
Yeah, we have figured it out.
I mean, there are a lot of questions. Some of which I would hope to resolve by watching it again, and some of which I would hope might be resolved by the sequel. We'll see. I mean, I come away from this at least interested and curious as to what they were going for.
I was intrigued by the different direction. Whether or not it makes sense, we'll wait and see. You know, like you said, there's a sequel that we're going to get to in a few episodes, and so I am curious to see if they try to build on this story a little bit more. But I liked that they tried something different, and I was genuinely surprised when 3 Jasons come out of the woods. I'm like, oh, well, this is not something that we've seen before. This isn't just a rehash of a Friday the 13th story that we've heard a million times. Like, this is really taking characters that we're familiar with and then turning it on its side and being like, oh yeah, well, you thought you knew what was going on, but you don't. Like, this is something completely different. And that's why I didn't know if is this like a Strangers thing where these are just like a Roy Burns situation where it's they're just going off and mimicking what Jason's doing. And then it was like, well, no, it's not that. And we still don't really know why it happened. And I don't know if we need to know why, but I think it did need to be made clearer what Megan's involvement was in this. Like, I don't need her motivation, outlined in a 10-minute exposition scene, but like at least establish that this was possible, because the only reason why it was shocking is because it makes no sense. And you're just like, well, like you're just surprising me. This isn't like it's the wrong kind of surprise. It's like, well, wait, why is this happening? It's not like, holy shit, I never considered it was Megan. Like, well, of course I never considered it was Megan. Why would I?
I mean, one thing this movie illustrated for me, perhaps intentionally, now that we've talked this through a little bit, is that you really have to be careful who you cast as Jason. There is a specific physique that works for Jason. And if you veer too far from that, it doesn't work. He can't be too pencil-necked. He can't be too hulking, but you need kind of a big dude. And anytime you drift away from that, it's obvious. And maybe that was part of the point of this movie. But that was something that I was noticing as we were watching it, is that, like, well, wait, that guy doesn't look like he should be playing Jason. Whereas the last movie we watched kind of did a good job of casting kind of heftier guys. And so, yeah, I almost wonder if they leaned into that with their plot line.
Well, that's another problem that you run into with these like fan films, is there's this degree of forgiveness that you're willing to allow because of the resources that are provided. So like when I saw Jason in 2 scenes and that Jason looked completely different in 2 scenes, the first thing that I thought was, well, these are just guys that like had 2 different Jasons playing. Like they couldn't get the same actor for the next day, and so they got like another friend to play it, or the mask that they were using broke, and so they had to use a different mask. Like I'm making excuses for why that may happen rather than thinking from it like from a story standpoint of why this could be happening. Like I'm just forgiving them for a rookie mistake because they're amateur filmmakers, rather than, ooh, this is an interesting story twist. But if this has taught me anything, it's like, well, I'm not going to allow that forgiveness to pop into my head anymore, because I'm going to give these guys, these filmmakers, the benefit of the doubt that they are actually trying something different and they're doing something on purpose. Now, there's probably going to be mistakes that we're going to see in future fan films, and that's fine. But I am going to give them the benefit of the doubt and be like, this was deliberate. This is part of the storyline. What could they be trying to do here?
Or they worked with what limitations they knew they had. They're like, we know we can't get one guy to play Jason for a week, so what kind of story can we come up with that might explain why he looks different?
And then one angle that I just wanted to introduce here at the very end, because I think it's a pretty rock solid theory that there's really no point into discussing further, is that this whole movie is really just communist propaganda, since the 3 main characters that are killed are all wearing red, white, and blue.
Interesting.
So wake up, people. Open your eyes. Do your research. This is what it is.
We should say this was written, directed, and edited by Tim McCormack. And, overall, I'm gonna praise it. I feel like it was very polished. It was nicely made. There were a few acting issues, but overall, I felt this was very solid, and I enjoyed it. And based on our discussion, I'm kind of interested to watch it again and see what I think on a second viewing.
Me too. And I'm looking forward to the sequel as well, just to see what they do with it. I don't want to get into the habit of comparing one fan film that we watched to another one, but I like that we, based on your idea, Greg, are watching these in release order, because it's going to be interesting to see because this is like a pretty significant jump in production quality from the last one that we watched. And I'm wondering if like that causes other people to up their game, where they're like, well, the last one that came out looked pretty good, so now we need to make ours look pretty good. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. But yeah, overall, I enjoyed this. I liked the twist at the end. The more I thought about it, the more it made my head hurt. But knowing that there is a sequel out there offers hope that we're going to get a little bit more explanation. But I thought it moved really quickly. And it was fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was punchy, no pun intended, but I wish it had been in French. I feel like we had the impenetrable accents last time, and I think that a nice solid French accent would have been helpful.
Before we sign off, we got a couple of notes. There's a kind of some bummer news in the Friday the 13th universe that happened a couple of days ago, where Ted White passed away. So
yeah.
Inarguably one of the best Jasons in all of the franchise from the final chapter.
Yeah, I think we both picked him as our favorite. But damn, that tough son of a bitch was 96 years old. So that's a hell of a run. And, he seemed like a fun, kind of irascible kind of guy. I mean, he talks some smack about Corey Feldman on the Crystal Lake documentary, but he's one of those gentlemen that I wish I could sit next to on a plane. He would probably have no patience whatsoever for me asking him questions about his stuntman and acting roles, but just a fascinating guy with a long career. I was bummed to see that.
And then lastly, a little self-indulgence here. So as a kid, I grew up as a really big Van Halen fan, and two friends of the show, Mark and Corey, have a podcast called And the Podcast Will Rock. And it's very similar in structure to what we do on our podcast, which is they're going through the Van Halen catalog one song at a time. And when they announced their show at the beginning of the year, I reached out to them. I was like, guys, I got to be on your show. I'd love to talk about Van Halen. And they got back to me, and I was able to appear on a recent episode. So if you have even the slightest bit of interest in listening to me yammer on about Van Halen, you can check out their podcast. Again, it's called And the Podcast Will Rock. But I had a really good time, and it was fun to nerd out on some Van Halen, which not many people have the patience to listen to me do. So I appreciate that they let me do that.
What song did you talk about?
It's called Sucker in a Three-Piece, which is kind of one of the lesser known songs from OU 812, which is a Sammy Hagar album. So
right on.
Yeah, it was fun. Something different, and I'm glad I got a deep cut to talk about. So if you're interested in seeing the sexy Jason centerfold in the latest issue of Drip Dry, you're just going to have to tune in to the next episode of You're All Doomed.
Au revoir.